Ladies and gentlemen, Brigadier General Robert Spalding, USAF retired, is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, focusing on U.S.-China relations, economic and national security, and the Asia-Pacific military balance. He is the author of the upcoming book, Stealth War, How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. Brigadier General Robert S. Spalding III assumed the duties of special assistant. This is from the Air Force website. I know you have since retired, sir. But your last assignment, you assumed the duties of special assistant to the U.S. Air Force Vice Chief of Staff in February 2018. General Spalding, I'm Hutch Bailey Jr. My co-host is Ward Miller. Welcome to Cold War Radio, sir.
Oh, thanks to be here. Thank you.
I'm delighted to have you on the program tonight. Let's first talk about your new book that's coming out. It seems really interesting, and being from
Timely.
Pittsburgh, as Ward and I both are, although it started with Japan, we watched the steel industry get sucked right out of our area right here. I think we were one of the first to experience that income redistribution. But please tell us about Stealth War, How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept.
Well, interestingly enough, the reason for the title is kind of alluding to my background in the Air Force as a stealth bomber pilot flying the B-2. But in reality, what it's really describing is exactly what you guys just talked about in terms of the loss of industrial capacity in the United States and the loss of millions, 3.4 million manufacturing jobs to China when they entered the WTO. So essentially what it talks about is how the Chinese Communist Party has used globalization and the internet to systematically erode both the economy, but also the society, the democratic principles of our country and other democracies through these relationships with the elites of the countries in academia, in politics, in corporate sector, in Wall Street here, in financial. So across the spectrum, essentially you have America's elites behaving in a manner that is essentially benefiting the Chinese Communist Party.
Absolutely. I was looking over your biography on the Air Force website, sir, and a couple things really jumped out at me. I mean, it's just a really long and distinguished bio, no doubt about that. But I only have you for a certain amount of time. I want to highlight a couple things. In 2001, you were selected as one of 3 Air Force Olmsted Scholars and was a distinguished graduate of Mandarin Chinese language training at the DLI, the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. I knew a supply sergeant that worked there. Afterward, you attended Tongji University in Shanghai as a graduate research student. So you're not just talking the talk, you were walking the walk, and it's just really heartwarming that we have people like you in our defense apparatus, sir.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, it was really a blessing in disguise. I went there, living there from 2002 to 2004, really watching all of America's Fortune 500 companies building factories in the Shanghai economic zone, and really listening to all their stories about how it was so hard to do business and make a profit yet they were still moving their factories because they wanted to have access at some point to the market. Of course, that access never came. They never really got a foothold there because essentially the Chinese Communist Party has created a closed economy that benefits their companies. So essentially, we sold our jobs, we sold our factories to the Chinese, and essentially they've been taking capital, technology, innovation, talent away from America and away from growing American businesses and creating American jobs, to the point where we can't even manufacture circuit boards for the F-35 now.
That's another thing. I understand that a lot of the arrangements with our corporations that relocate or if not totally relocate, place satellite manufacturing operations in China, that they have to give up their proprietary information as well. And then everybody's stunned when Chinese companies are making the same thing. But the second thing that jumped out in your resume, I'm a retired Army officer, 33 years. And during the Iraq surge in 2007, you deployed to Baghdad and directed the Personal Security Coordination Center. I was there during the surge as well, as the G4 maintenance officer for the Sustainment Command at the time, the 316th Expeditionary Sustainment Command. And I just wondered if you remember Operation, I think it was called Operation Silver Bison or Gray Bison, when Vice President Cheney came to the theater. That was an interesting operation that happened during the surge in Iraq. And
I don't remember that one. I do remember, I think, Condoleezza Rice coming, because I remember seeing her at the embassy. I think that was more during the fall of that year, but I don't remember the vice president.
Okay, I have the Army side. I'm going to switch it over to the Air Force side and introduce Ward Miller. Go ahead, Ward.
Yes, sir. I have a question, and it's kind of cool that you're on today because with the announcement that President Trump made at the G7 about, China wanting to come back to the table now because the tariffs, they want to calm down the stock markets, since the beginning of the trade war, et cetera. And I'm just kind of curious, what's your take on why it happened so quick? To me, it seems like that's, when you're applying tariffs, that shouldn't be something that, within 3 months, it makes you give up the ship. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I think what you're beginning to see is, the President Xi Jinping, he's really having trouble. He's got Hong Kong going on now. He's got the tariffs going on now, but it's not just the tariffs. We're essentially beginning to decouple. It's in finance, it's investment. We had CFIUS reform, the FIRMA Act. We have essentially re-strengthening the Foreign Agent Registration Act. In finance, Senator Rubio has a bill that's going to require Chinese companies to actually meet U.S. audit requirements to be listed on our stock exchange. And if they don't meet those requirements, then they'll be delisted. So essentially, it's across all elements: finance, trade, investment, immigration, media, politics, the internet, that it's on a full court press. So this is going to continue to unwind for them. They're going to have a hard time dealing with ramifications to their economy. And quite frankly, they've decided that they think they would rather decouple from the U.S. economy than restructure to more market-based reforms.
So this would this full court press, as you called it, is that also during the campaign? President Trump mentioned going after the Chinese for stolen IP and et cetera. Is that all wrapped into this too? Is the intellectual property and whatnot?
Yeah, it's all part of it. So what you're seeing is the entire federal government really, as you guys know, once the NSS hits the street, then the national defense strategy, the national military strategy put out about by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and then all of the other departments and agencies, state, Treasury, Commerce, the U.S. Trade Representative, DOJ, the FBI, they all begin to cover down on what is the new game plan, and essentially it is to provide complete pressure across the board to this anti-competitive, this parasitic economy that the Chinese Communist Party has, and really to start promoting. You've seen Secretary Pompeo start promoting democratic principles, rule of law, human rights, and calling the Chinese out for the Uyghurs and human organ harvesting and all the other bad things that they're doing.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us Brigadier General retired Spalding, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, focusing on U.S.-China relations, economic and national security, and the Asia-Pacific military balance. I'd like to go there, sir. It seems to me that we just apparently got a really good trade deal with Japan. But I wonder, and I'm really glad you're here because most people don't even dig into this that much. I happen to be stationed in Korea in the early 1980s, early mid 80s. And Japan's history with China, specifically Nanking, in 1937, over about 6 weeks, the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces brutally murdered hundreds of thousands of Chinese. It was known as the Rape of Nanking. And then you also have Korea that was under Japanese rule between 1910 and 1945 when they surrendered in World War II. But that occupation was really the Japanization of the Korean people. They even outlawed their language, Hanguk. And I just wonder, we're looking at things as they are today, like I think we do a lot. But what are the ramifications of that deep, long history in the region between themselves? I mean, can Japan and China and Korea ever reconcile fully, or what are your thoughts on that, sir?
Well, I think there are deep animosities amongst the different countries, but I think what I'm focused on with the G7 is the fact that, essentially what the United States is trying to do in executing the national security strategy is align economic relationships with security relationships with our allies and partners. In other words, if we have a strong security relationship, then we expect to have a strong economic, finance, and trade relationship. And so the Japanese, trade agreement, I think, is very important in signifying that this is the direction we're headed. I think a lot of the media got distracted by, the Iranian foreign minister crashing the party and this phone call from the Chinese. The Chinese have no intent really to negotiate toward a trade agreement that would be worthwhile to sign for the United States. And more importantly, going forward, they're going to find themselves on the outside looking in. Now, in terms of Japan and Korea, I think, they both, you have to wonder, do they value their relationship, their security relationship with the United States more than they value the need to go after each other? I think that's the question that, it shouldn't be too tough to answer. They both rely very heavily on the United States security relationship and aren't going to be going looking for another partner anytime soon. So eventually that's going to have to get cleaned up.
Well, that's good to hear. The other thing that's really good to hear that you mentioned, I kind of coined it as the rank of field marshal. They finally brought the U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer and the rest of the economic crew into a real power position when it comes to diplomacy. And I can't really remember a time when that happened before. I mean, it happened in small ways, but it seems that this president understands that economics are every bit as important as combatants. I mean, these guys are really shaking the world up, especially with the globalist legacy that we have inherited.
Absolutely. And, when I got to the White House, there was, I remember, folks in the National Security Council and National Economic Council saying, well, economic security and national security, there's no relation between the two. And I said, no, that's absolutely not true. Economic security actually underpins everything. If you don't have a strong economy, you can't even buy the things you need. Just ask the Russians after the Soviet Union collapsed. So, what the Chinese have been able to do with our help is essentially maneuver us into position, much like we had maneuvered the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And we've got to get out and we've got to turn the tables. And that's what the national security strategy is about. And it's being executed.
Well, sir, while we have you on the line, I'm curious as to what are your thoughts that Beijing's next step on Hong Kong will be?
I think what they're trying to do is infiltrate enough folks in there to create a need by the protesters to strike out, to lash out, so that they can turn around and say they're being violent, they're terrorists, and so that they can move the PLA in to suppress it. So they're trying to build a media campaign to support that, and as long as the protesters don't rise to the bait, I think the Communist Party is going to have a tough time.
All right, so let's look at the big cookie, Taiwan, and talk a little bit about the Spratlys and the Paracels. South China Sea islands, much has been made in the mainstream media over China's ongoing military buildup on reefs in the South China Sea. We've been reporting this for many years, more than 7 years already. Chinese action has thus far been largely contained to two island groups, the Spratlys and the Paracels, though China has indeed been building extensively on these island groups, creating harbors, missile defense systems. How does that play into all this with the freedom of the seas? And I'm not quoting that properly, but the normal commerce that goes on. Do you see a hot point in Taiwan or in the South China Sea that's going to derail any of this?
Well, you have to go back all the way to the 1980s when the Communist Party asked the PLA to do something about what Vietnam was doing in terms of establishing outposts out in the South China Sea. And what the PLA said is we don't have the ability to be out there in depth because we need to resupply, and we just don't have the capacity to do that today. So I mean, this was laid over from the 80s. And they just waited for the time when they had enough economic power to go out and build those islands in the South China Sea. And they use them basically as bases to exert de facto control over the region. I doubt that there's going to be a conflict in the region. It's really far too risky a proposition for the Chinese, and with all the other challenges they have going on. They've got a large People's Armed Police that's focused on controlling the population, so they spend more money on that than they do on their military. But nevertheless, they are out there causing problems, and so I think what we have to do is essentially continue to deter military conflict while we allow this other full pressure campaign to essentially take its course.
I understand. I have one final area, and I'm not sure whether you're even interested in this, but I just want to ask you, our food supply, when you talk about economics in China, I recently saw, and this is a conservative station, a conservative show, but I actually saw Senator Gillibrand investigating a situation where the Chinese Communist government, basically an oligarchy, I mean, the meat companies that she was talking about were doing the bidding of the Chinese government. But there's a lot of American corporations and businesses that are in our food industry that have been pretty much bought and controlled by China. Is that on your radar at all, sir?
Oh, absolutely. Smithfield was a huge project for them.
My favorite bacon.
And so essentially what they're trying to do is industrialize their food supply. It's really, they lose a lot in the logistics and transportation and processing of food. So they're trying to take, essentially what they've done to every other industry in the United States, take our know-how for our food industry and apply it to their country. So no, it is definitely a big problem. But I mean, there's so many problems with what they're doing across the board in just about every industry. And it's time that we stood up for ourselves and we kicked them out and we began to invest in our people and in our country again.
Wow, that sounds good. General Spalding, I know you're a very busy man. I'd like you to, as you know, the title of the program, Cold War Radio, you're a very valuable guest with what we talk about on this program. I'd love to have you back. I hope you can come back again. You really, like I said, have the credentials. Speak Mandarin Chinese. That blows me away right just from the beginning. But talk about your book one more time, and how can people get in touch with you or help what you're doing? It's all yours.
Yeah, so the book is going to be out in wherever books are sold on October 1st. That people can follow me on Twitter. My handle is Robert_Spalding, Spalding. Happy to come back anytime.
Well, thank you very much. Ward?
Yes, thank you, sir. We appreciate you taking your time to spend a little bit of time with us and our audience. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. General Robert S. Spalding III